So my eye was recently caught by two pieces that were in the news. One is that a mass grave is going to be opened in Guatemala City that may contain up to 40,000 bodies. This came up around the same time as the Sunday, March 9th, 2009, New York Times article about a Spanish court weighing criminal inquiry on torture for 6 Bush-era officials. And in part, what I find interesting about these two things coming together is this question of how to deal with the past in the present, and what ways the past creates possibilities and can also shut down possibilities for the future. I think those are both questions that are being raised in Guatemala after 36 years of civil war, a peace treaty which was signed in 1996, and the United Nations peacekeepers leaving in 2005. So it's a succession of kind of processings of what might peace mean, how might this war of 36 years end. And I think it's very interesting that in the United States as well, we're dealing with these questions of how to deal with a recent past that was also, in this case, dealing with torture, dealing with certain kinds of human rights abuses, dealing with certain questions around injustice, which I think are both deeply embedded in both Guatemala and the United States. So one of the things that I've been interested in thinking about those relations as a North American who works in Latin America is the question of reckoning. And the word reckoning, of course, has many meanings. One is the notion of a day of reckoning, a day of judgment. It also has a sort of counting aspect. To reckon something is to count or to figure up. But it also has a sort of moral or futuristic understanding of to reckon, meaning to measure possibilities for the future, as well as to settle rewards or penalties for actions. So for example, what's happening in this possible case brought by the Spanish court by Justice Garzón is that John Yoo and several other people might be brought to trial. They're still opening it. And the question then is, will this simply be symbolic to open up indictments against these guys? Will they necessarily be arrested? Would they actually ever have to serve time if they were found guilty? These questions of the symbolic versus material effects of reckoning are something that a lot of people in Guatemala are dealing with. I know a Guatemalan woman, a widow, a Mayan woman, who had been working to get the grave where her husband was buried to be exhumed so that he could be reburied. It had been a secret cemetery where the army had left bodies after a massacre in Highland, Guatemala. And as they were going through the process of getting forensic anthropologists in to do that exhumation, one of her neighbors said, "What are you going to do with those bones? Make them into soup?" And part of the question that comes up is like, what material good can come out of dredging up these effects of the past? Is it simply symbolic? Why would you put so much energy into it? And again, that's something that I think people all over the world are having to deal with different kinds of pasts of violence. The past is over, maybe that's good, as opposed to other folks who say, no, there's a vital moral, psychological, social, and political project in remembering that past and recognizing what's at stake in it. And what I've found over and over in the work that I've been doing in Guatemala since 1985 is that even as some of the worst of the violence, the scorched earth counterinsurgency in which over 250,000 people were killed and over 430 villages were destroyed, 93% of which were carried out by the state or the military governments, is that even though some of that happened in the early 80s, again, 96, a peace treaty, the past keeps coming back. As Walter Benjamin might say, it makes a tiger's leap into the present in so many different ways. And some of the things I've been exploring is what that means. How do people live in these kinds of presents? What kinds of futures are they trying to produce through these reckonings? For example, there's an older Maya Quiche woman who I've known for a number of years who, when I took a walk up to a town where there had been a massacre and came down that evening and was having dinner with her in her kitchen, she'd never spoken to me about the violence before. We had a sort of different kind of relationship. But when she heard that I'd taken this walk up to this massacre site, she just suddenly became almost possessed by memories. And she said, "Oh, I remember that, I remember that. The army came and made my husband walk through the night. In the night, they were walking and walking in the night. When they came to the village, they had to kill people with their machetes." And then in her kitchen, this very homey place, with a fire going and tortillas on the fire, she made as if she were lifting up a child and sort of smashing its head into the sort of edge of her stove. That's how they killed the children. we women had to cook. We had to cook for the men, but when they came back, they were so horrified at what they'd done that they couldn't eat. It was so terrible. It was so terrible. So here, literally 20 years after this had happened, it's almost as if it were still alive in certain kinds of spaces. I find a very similar thing going on with some of the quote-unquote traditional Mayan dances that are performed in a lot of different highland indigenous villages, where older meanings about relations to saints, relations to time, can get telescoped down into being ways to commemorate what happened in the recent past and going into the future. There's a dance called the Dance of the Snake, in which villagers, they're all played by indigenous men, but there's a character who's a non-indigenous. He sort of wears this white wooden mask, and he sort of forces people to go work for him, and he bends their bodies over to use their back to account for their debts, and then makes them do work for him. And then they get together, and they actually bring out these poisonous snakes, like actual snakes, and dance with them, and then, conspire, and late at night they sort of place the snakes up into the costume, these very elaborate velvet and feather-covered costumes of this non-indigenous guy, the labor contractor, and the snake bites him, and as the audience is watching, it's hilarious that he's dying, and and yet the man is able to come back to life because he has magic potions and then punish people. So in some ways, this is a very old story. It's a dance that's been done for at least several hundred years. Yet it's also a story about what happened during the revolutionary period in Guatemala, when people did take up arms. People did try to change situations of injustice where they weren't paid fairly for their work, where they could work many, many hours a day and still not be able to feed or educate their children, in which non-indigenous people really lived in a very brutal, racist kind of society with each other. And the sort of hopes or the ideals or the ends, right, what people were fighting for were to change some of those injustices. And sort of the question, of course, now is, now that the war is over, now that it has ended, how are those ends, those hopes, going to be made sense of when you sort of made an attempt to change it? That change was not, for many people, it wasn't what they had hoped it would be. And so they need not only to sort of think about the acts of violence that they were involved with, the acts of violence that hurt them and their families, but what that's going to mean for the future. Sort of what kinds of programs, what kinds of projects should be taken up. And just to finish, in 1954, the United States had to confront its racist past with the Brown versus Board. And many people see sort of that process giving rise to Obama's election last year, and that sort of sense that finally maybe this is ending. 1954 was also the US-backed coup against the democratically elected government in Guatemala, and I think we're still seeing the attempt to come to reckon or to end the effects of that process.